I'm Luther Thrift, and a lot of people know me as the Old Swamper. So if you can't remember my name, just think about the Old Swamper. I have had some of the best years of my life taking people into the Okefenokee and telling them about the most beautiful place I've ever been. What I'm here for, though, this afternoon is to tell you about some of my kinfolks. One in particular, and his name is Chris Tatum. Now you say, well, you're a Thrift. What in the world are you doing talking about the Tatums? Well, my daddy was named George Tatum Thrift, and he went by Tatum. Tatum Thrift was probate judge, or ordinary, when he died in 1961. And oddly enough, my daddy was born down at Tatumville. Now, you say, I never heard of Tatumville. Well, if you ever went to the Tatum reunion in the last 70, 80 years, you were at Tatumville. Tatumville was a big naval stores or turpentine operation in the 90s and right on up into the 40s and 50s even. But it started waning. Turpentine started waning in the late 50s. Tatumville was first started by my great-great-granddaddy, George Tatum, who went off to the Confederate War. They were all started into turpentine, but that was in 1860 when he moved down to the swamp from over in Emerson Park area. Now, he was born over in the area called, in 1826, he was born over in the area called Ben James area. And today that's in Pierce County. But back when he was born, it was Ware County. Keep in mind now that Pierce County didn't come into being until 1857. Now, Grandpa Tatum didn't come back from the war. We didn't know what happened to him until after searching for several years, being a history student, especially Southern history, Confederate history, and genealogy, I discovered that Grandpa Tatum had died up in Richmond, Virginia, and was buried in Oakwood Cemetery out in Richmond, Virginia. Now, Grandma was Sarah Tatum, and actually she was Sarah Sweat Tatum, and of course her folks lived over in the Ben James area too. Now, Grandma Sarah, when Granddaddy went to the Army in 1863, she had 8 children, and she was pregnant with the baby. Now, Grandpa didn't come back. After a few years, she was in bad shape. They grew their own food, naturally, and they had plenty of fish and stuff to eat, but money was scarce. Now, when Grandma was really getting desperate, here comes an old man named George Dunham from over in Liberty County. And he was an old man, but he had a little money. And he left that part of Georgia because Sherman was coming in. And he got the train, which then ran to Thomasville, and he got off the train, I think, at Glenmore, and he was hunting him a place to stay, and he ran in, somebody told him about Grandma, he could board with her. So he did, and they got married because, get this, Grandpa George Dunham was a veteran of the War of 1812. The only veteran I ever knew was Grandpa George Dunham. And he draws something like $8.75 a month federal pension. So, and then when he died a few years later, Grandma kept drawing his pension. So we get on down now to George Tatum is living down there. His widow and children are living down here near between Gum Swamp and Black River. And here she raised these children up. And then we have the second George, which is George Hamilton Sr. And he and his brother Math Tatum got into the turpentine business. So in about 1890 something, we had Tatumville started. After 1900, I think at one time, my great Uncle Toomer, who was well known, and matter of fact, Uncle Toomer was once, he did a little bit of everything besides fishing and hunting, but he was a salesman. He sold beef cattle, hogs. He used to buy for meat packers and all. But Uncle Toomer was pretty well known. He was a great storyteller. But anyway, down at Tatumville, after great-granddaddy George Hamilton Sr. died, his son Elias and George Hamilton Jr. had to take over the operation of Tatumville. Well, at one time now, Uncle Math Tatum had gone into business with my granddaddy Thrift, William Hardy Thrift, and his brother George. And of course, they always had their brother Lee and Thrift with them. Now, they were all in the naval store business together. 1916, my daddy, George Tatum Thrift, was born down there at Tatumville. A few years later, Chris Tatum's daddy, James Hamilton Tatum, Hamp they called him, was born. So there's more Tatum connection. Now, Hamp Tatum, Chris's daddy, married a young girl named Hazel Crawford. Now, Hazel Crawford was kin to all the Crawfords. Her older ancestors established a lot of the churches around here. Matter of fact, over in what is now Pierce County, they established Shiloh Church, which is the oldest church in Pierce County. This was in 1833. Now, this was still Ware County. Remember, Pierce didn't come into being until actually 1858 when they started electing all the county officers. Now, Hazel Crawford, Mama, was a Thrift, believe it or not. Now, there again, Chris and I link up again. So, anyway, on down the line, or going back on the Tatum side, George Hamilton Jr. dies in 1945. Now, he had married Lottie Melissa Wiles Tatum. Now, Aunt Lottie's daddy was Leonard Wiles, and she was raised up over near what we call Emerson Park, or a little down the road there. And Uncle Leonard ran an abattoir plant. He butchered beef and hogs, probably a few goats too. Now, Aunt Lottie, brother, she had 4 brothers and she was the only girl, and all of her brothers, they'd go sometime down as far as Argyle and buy maybe 25, 50 head of cattle and drive them back to Uncle Leonard's plant up there where he butchered them. And naturally, Aunt Lottie, being raised up with a bunch of cowboy brothers, she became a real equestrian. Oh, she loved a horse. Her daddy bought her a horse named Tom. When she was about 2 years old, and the horse was about 2 years old. They kept that horse till he died at 39 years old. And they know why he, skeeters like me. They know how old he was because he was, matter of fact, I wrote a story one time about old Tom. But getting back on Aunt Lottie, her daddy was, I'll tell you what, I've heard some of the old ones talk about Uncle Lynn, and he would sometime on Saturday load up his wagon and have a dozen or more children in it. Take them uptown to the Ritz Theater. He'd buy them all popcorn and drinks and candy and feed them. And then that afternoon he'd bring them all back home. Now, they all grew up loving him. He fed a lot of the people around there. When they would butcher things that they didn't really sell much back then, like beef tripe and all, he'd give it to people. So a lot of people depended on Uncle Leonard for their meat. Now, Aunt Lottie, after Uncle George died in 1945, her baby, little Toomer, was only 2 years old. Of course, I was only 2 years old. Of course, I'm a month older than Toomer. So I don't remember Uncle George that much. I can't hardly remember him at all. But ever since I was little, we went to the Tatum reunion every year. Aunt Lottie was the hostess. She conducted and ran everything. And people came from miles around. And Tatums not only were well known for their friendliness to people and neighbors, anybody sometime would stop by. Aunt Lottie's door was always open. And she'd say, come on in, have a piece of cake or something. We got the coffee pot on. Or we got some tea. Back then, when the Herbert Cypress came in 1909 and built the railroad, everybody along the railroad, or close to it, had ice, or access to block ice from Atlantic Ice Company. A lot of people would buy a 300-pound block of ice. They'd throw it off the train, and you'd build you a box and fill it up with sawdust, and then put the ice in it, or put the ice in and fill it up with sawdust. And a 300-pound block of ice sometimes lasts a small family a week, 4 or 5 days anyway. But a big family like the Tatum down there, I don't know how many blocks of ice they got every week. But they began drinking iced tea. First tea we drank down here since, I guess since we quit in 1773 with the Boston Tea Party. We quit drinking tea. A lot of people don't know that's why Americans started drinking coffee. It was in rebellion against the heavy tea tax that the British. That's one reason we came to America. Now, you talk about how long have we been here. My and Chris's great-great-great-great-granddaddy John Tatum was here in 1818. And in 1820, the General Assembly of Georgia got all of South Georgia from the Creek Indians. They call themselves Muskogee. But anyway, Grandpa Tatum and of course his old buddy John Lee, they came down from North Carolina, and they got into the cattle business like everybody, called, believe it or not, they were what they called back then crackers. Now, taking people into the Okefenokee, I often would mention something about the early crackers, and some of them would say, well, what is a cracker? And I said, well, make it short, one letter, one word, cowboy. And some of them said, well, I don't know much about the crackers. Well, go back and read Shakespeare in, I think it was 1595. Yeah, 1590 something, 4 or 5. Shakespeare wrote a play called King John. And in it, a man is talking about the Scott crackers. And they are the cattle raisers, the hog raisers, mostly cattle. And back then they didn't ride a horse that much, so it messes up this old story about they cracked the whip and drove cows. Well, down here we did. But over there, they walked along with a long pole and punched them or poked them. There's 2 terms now that's still alive with cowboys, cow puncher and cow poke. It goes all the way back to Scotland in the 1500s. Now, the crackers, the term cracker means that you're a loud, boisterous talker. And in the play King John, this fella mentions about the crackers. He said they are forever moving around, and they are loud talkers, and all they want to do is tell jokes and stories and laugh and watch their livestock. And of course the English were a little bit jealous of them because they usually spoke of them condescendingly, because they thought you're supposed to work 6 days a week in some kind of little building, where you're a shoemaker, cobbler, or cooper, a barrel maker, or whatever you did. They thought you're supposed to work 6 days a week. And they looked at on the weekends, the crackers were always dancing and singing and frolicking. So they were kind of, I don't know if it was envy, maybe it was jealousy of the crackers. So everybody always had to speak kind of sarcastically about the crackers. But anyway, after Uncle Lynn Wiles, we got into Aunt Lottie, and you get back to Aunt Lottie. Aunt Lottie was one of the most knowledgeable women that I ever knew in my life. I spent a lot of time with her. I used to go see her every chance I got. And she would tell me all about her family and her ancestors. And her granddaddy was one of the survivors of the Wiles Massacre, which was the last Indian massacre in Georgia. But Aunt Lottie could tell you everybody. She could tell you all her aunts, how many babies they had. If one choked on an apple when he was 3 months old or something, or 3 years old. Anyway, Aunt Lottie made the Tatum reunion kind of a household word in Ware County. Called it. When it come to second Sunday in June, every year everybody'd say, not just the Tatums, it would be people from everywhere that knew them. Because, and when they got there, we might have 500, 600, 700 people. I think one time we had close to 1,000, or maybe a little over 1,000, when Governor Maddox visited. I'm not sure just which one it was. But anyway, the Tatums became very popular for their hugging and kissing. And I heard a fella say one time, he said, I've been hugged. But he said, there ain't nobody been hugged until they were hugged by a Tatum. He said, when a Tatum hugs you, he don't just gently put his arms and barely touch you. He said, son, he gives you a bear hug, and you know that he means it. He said, and it's that atmosphere that Chris Tatum was raised in. I mean, all his life, he's hugged and kissed everybody. And he's been hugged. He's been set on their laps when he was little, just like I was. All the old people would set you on their lap and they'd tell you stories. And so I know it's hard for Chris right now with this virus on. He's got to stand off from people and wear the mask. And they can't see his mustache half the time. But I've thought a lot about this. If somebody, especially somebody like Westerns, and most of us down here, all cowboys always wanted to be. I never did quite make it, but always wanted to be. Horses were always a big thing with me. I shoot horses over 50 years. But anyway, if you saw Chris coming down the sidewalk in Waycross and he had a hat on, like, come here, John, let him get a shot of your hat. Huh? If Chris Tatum, and they're about the same height, or is he taller?
About the same height.
All right, come here. Let him see your hat. If you saw Chris Tatum coming down the sidewalk meeting you, and he had a hat on like that, first thing you might say, if you didn't know him, you'd say, doggone, there's Wyatt Earp. That's the image of a lawman a lot of people think of as Wyatt Earp. Well, Chris has always been a lawman. He spent over 30 years, I think it was about 34 years he spent with the Waycross Police Department. He worked himself all the way up to major. And ever, I don't know, the last 20, 30, 40 years, ever since we'd be talking about something, he'd say, I said, how's the police department? He'd say, it's all right, but I'd like to be sheriff. And he's always wanted to be sheriff of Ware County. Chris has always had these big ideas. He never did leave home because he knew he was a big fella in the big city, the biggest city and the biggest county and the biggest state east of the Mississippi. So when you see Chris, he thinks big. Yeah, he thinks big. But he's his mama and his grandma. He had a great uncle. We both shared a great uncle named Toomer Tatum. And Uncle Toomer was a well-known fellow. Matter of fact, did I tell you? I may have said this before. Uncle Toomer was once deputy sheriff in Ware County, but I'm trying to think of some of his. But get right down to it, the crackers, the cowboys. Now, I know one feller that Chris knows very well. He has an uncle. One of his uncles just died, Elias, and Elias was a cowboy. He ride the rope just like the rest of them. But anyway, Elias just died a few months ago, and but he still has his oldest uncle next to his daddy. He has another George, and this is George Leonard Tatum Sr. Now, last May, cousin George, Big George, some call him, Uncle George, some call him Pa George, and then people from other places where he has worked on ranches, even down in Florida, they know him as Cowboy. They say, hey, there's old Cowboy. And he likes that. But he is the only person I have ever known that lived his dream from the time he was a little boy. He sat on his mama's horse when he was a year or 2 years old, and old Tom was his nurse. They'd saddle up old Tom and stick George up there, and old Tom would graze. He was wore out. He was in his late 30s then, and he'd graze all over the place, down in the steel quarters and all. And there's George sitting up there. Sometime he'd go to sleep, but he'd hang on to the saddle, the pommel or horn of the saddle. And he learned to ride from the time he was a little baby. So he always liked being a cowboy. So we still had cattle then, but later on things got bad, and George, after he got out of the army and all, he still wanted to be a cowboy. So he just started going and working. He worked over in Ashburn, Georgia, worked down in Florida and several other places, big ranches. But George did what he liked to do, be a cowboy. That's, I guess that brings us pretty well up to date. Now Chris has worked in the city, but every chance he gets, when you turn him loose, he heads for the woods. He can't help it. I guess you might say it's in his blood. He likes to fish and he likes to hunt. And every now and then he'll stop by, and pretty regular sometimes he'll stop by. He'll be down to the swamp at the club deer hunting. But to sum it all up, we got an election coming up in a few weeks. Some of them start voting tomorrow. I think they're early voting. But if you get down to the place where it says sheriff, think of cousin Chris Tatum. He would make one more super sheriff. Now, after all said and done, you might say, well, Luther, you must like him. Like him? I love him. He's just excuse me. He's just a good boy. And I can't help but love him, and I think he would be a good sheriff. So when you go to the vote this next few weeks, think of Chris Tatum. And I appreciate your time, folks. And this is the old Swamper Luther Thrift saying, much obliged.